Good afternoon, and I'd like to welcome you to our 23rd lecture and the last lecture of the fall quarter. Our speaker today, Dr. Seymour Martin Lipset, was born in New York City in 1922. He received his Bachelor of Science from City College in New York, and his City College fan, and his PhD from Columbia in 1949. Professor Lipset has taught at Berkeley, Columbia, and presently at Harvard. He has authored such books as Agrarian Socialism, Union Democracy, Political Man, and The First New Nation. Professor Lipset's lecture today is an amplification of themes raised in his recently published study of right-wing extremism, The Politics of Unreason, which received the Gunnar Myrdal Prize. Rather than repeating what is in the book, he proposes to place the phenomena of right-wing extremism in the general context of an explanation of social movement of all varieties in America. A question-answer period will follow after the lecture. It is now my pleasure to introduce Professor Seymour Martin Lipset.
Thank you very much, Mr. Elias. As Chairman indicated, I want to talk on a more broader theme than the one announced of right-wing extremism, because while I will talk to and try to explain the phenomenon of it as an American phenomenon, at least as I understand it, I think at least part of the explanation or part of the background needed to understand the phenomenon of the repeated currents of right-wing extremism which we've had in American society from the early 19th century down to the contemporary George Wallace movement, that part of this phenomenon has to be seen within certain enduring characteristics of American morality and American social structure, which have given rise to what is a general American phenomenon, that is the propensity for social movements. And it's in this context of the propensity of the United States to produce social movements, social protest movements, seeking to either create social change, make changes of minor or major varieties in the society, or to prevent these changes which are going on by groups who resist them, or even to reverse, to change back to a previous age. It's in this context of the social movement as an American phenomenon that I think the general phenomenon of right-wing activity has to be seen. Now, many people, foreigners and Americans alike, have seen the American political system as essentially a conservative system, one that is in many ways more conservative than the systems of other Western democratic countries, pointing to at least one major aspect of it, namely the enduring character of the two-party system in the United States. You know, the oldest political party, the oldest organization going under the name of a political party, which has had continuous history in the world, is the Democratic Party. There is none older. The two-party system has changed, of course, over time. Mainly the opponents of the Democrats have changed their names from the Federalists to the Whigs to the Republicans. But essentially, the basic characteristics of that system seemingly have remained constant. And the fact of that, the fact that the United States, for example, is the only country in the Western world, in the democratic world, that doesn't have a socialist party of any significance, it seems sufficient evidence to many analysts, critics, and others, friends of the system, that it is a stable system, a system which has successfully resisted social change, or more successfully resisted it for whatever reason, than other societies. Well, I would submit that while it's obviously true that we have this enduring two-party system which has had more ability to resist efforts to create opponents of it on the outside than any other comparable system, that there's another attribute of the United States that has to be seen side by side with this system, and which is in fact one reason why the system is an outgrowth really of the system, and that is the propensity for social movements. That is, we have few or no viable third parties. We have many major social movements. And in this context, I think one can say we have more social movements of significance, more protest activity than any other Western country. And in effect, what happens in the American system is, because the American electoral system, the American constitutional system, makes it extremely difficult to produce, to institutionalize protest or different opinions in varying political parties. One part reaction to it, but it's not the only one and not even necessarily the most important one, is the existence of the social movement as the vehicle of social change and of protest. Social movements in the context in which I'm discussing it, range from single issue movements like the abolitionist movement, the prohibition movement, different variants of the feminist movement that have appeared, different variants of the civil rights movement in contemporary society, to various right-wing movements that Earl Rabb and I discussed at some length historically in this book, The Politics of Unreason, which Mr. Elias referred to. We have had, for example, a large number of mass right-wing movements, some of which have taken the form of political parties for periods of time. The concept of the movement and of the political party are not indistinguishably separate. Some movements have taken the form of political parties and have declined. Other movements have tried to work through the parties. In this context of the right-wing movements, for example, to just go very briefly through them, we had a mass right-wing movement that we at least attribute and attempt to document as a right-wing movement known as the Anti-Masons in the 1820s and 30s, which got tremendous votes, elected governors in Pennsylvania and some other states. The Know Nothing Party, or the American Party, before the Civil War, was a mass racist, anti-Catholic political party, which even on its way down got 25% of the vote for president in 1856, but was far stronger in a year or two before that. The American Protective Association, which was a massive anti-Catholic nativist movement of the 1890s. The Ku Klux Klan of the 20s, with its many millions of members and its ability to elect governors and senators. Various right-wing movements in the 30s, and then George Wallace and his following in the 1860s, a following which seemingly still exists into the 1970s, rather, given the fact the polls report that he still gets 10% of the vote in the opinion polls. Counterposing the presence of right-wing movements, one should note that in almost every period in which we've had a significant right-wing movement, that is a movement which seeks to prevent entry into American society of certain groups trying to enter, either from without or from within, which seeks to perpetuate established privileges, either of large groups or small. We've had left-wing movements, movements which seek to open the system to groups that are not yet in it. And in general, periods of the growth of right-wing movements have been also the periods of the existence of left-wing movements. In fact, in a sense, for reasons which I think are in one sense obvious once one thinks of it, the conditions which make a left-wing movement possible also encourage a right-wing movement and vice versa. That is, these are conditions which mean that something that's maintaining the legitimacy, the stability, the authority of the larger system is broken down, and in the context of this breakdown of the stability of the larger system, you have defections from it, organized protest defections to the left and right. Well, the period of the Anti-Masons was the period of the workingmen's parties. The workingmen's parties also got large votes. They weren't quite as large as the Anti-Masons. This was the 1820s and 30s. The period of the Know-Nothings was the period of various abolitionist movements, the Free Soil movement and others. The period of the American Protective Association, the 1890s, on the right was the period of the Populist Party on the left. The period of the Ku Klux Klan on the right in the 20s was the period of the progressive movement of Senator La Follette and his party on the left in 1924. During the 30s, when we had the Coglenites and many other right-wing, extreme right-wing movements, we also had the growth of left-wing parties and movements that were outside and to the left of the Democratic Party. And the period, of course, of George Wallace has also been the period of massive protest movements on the left in the form of civil rights, anti-war movements, and of the general phenomenon known as the New Left. So that while there are exceptions to this pattern of polarization or of comparability, in general we've had movements of the left and right arising repeatedly, arising on a number of occasions in the United States. It also should be noted in the context of movements that there's another phenomenon that is of obvious major significance in contemporary American society of the late 1960s and seemingly the early 1970s, the anti-war movement, which is again not a unique phenomenon. The struggle for peace, the pacifism, the resistance to wars is again an enduring aspect of American society. We've had large mass peace or pacifist movements for much of American history, going back practically to the beginning of the 19th century. But specifically, and I can't again go in any details on them, I think it should be noted that every single war the United States has taken part in, with the one exception of World War II for highly special reasons, has seen a mass opposition to it. The War of 1812 was strongly opposed by New Englanders and others. A number of states threatened to secede, refused to fight, and the like. Were pro-British or pro-Canadian. You had a lot of pro-British, pro-Canadian sentiment. The Mexican War was strongly opposed, both inside and outside of Congress, and a fact which is relatively little known is that there were American battalions of deserters from the American Army who fought with the Mexican Army during the Mexican War. There are a few articles on this written on American soldiers who literally went over and joined the enemy because they felt this was an evil, immoral war. The Civil War saw large opposition, large resistance to participation in it, both in the North and the South, by people who were unsympathetic with its objectives or the way it was run in both sides. The Spanish-American War didn't last long enough to precipitate a mass movement against it, but it did see a very considerable opposition. A recent essay on opposition to the Spanish-American War quotes Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., writing a letter to a friend saying how happy he was to be outside, to have escaped the confines of Harvard, where all one heard was seditious and anti-war talk. And if the Philippine insurrection, which followed on the Spanish-American War, witnessed many Americans who supported the Filipinos and opposed imperialism. World War I, again, was strongly opposed while the war was going on. Close to 1/5 of the people who were called up for the draft resisted the draft. Were offenders, according to the statistics of the War Department in World War I. The Socialist Party, which was opposed to the war, and which never had gotten more than 6% of the vote in any election, it got that for president in 1912, got 20% of the vote in a number of cities in the elections of 1917 when socialist candidates for mayor ran on anti-war programs opposing the war, and this was interpreted, I think, from what one can tell historically correctly, as a referendum on the war. And there was large conscientious opposition movements to the war. World War II, as I mentioned earlier, did not see an anti-war movement of any significance, seemingly because of the fact that that was the one war we were in which began by an attack on the United States by a foreign enemy. And the fact of the Pearl Harbor attack seemingly reduced the very massive opposition to entry into war that existed in the form of the America First Committee and other groups to impotence. They just stopped, though their feelings presumably hadn't changed. The Korean War also saw considerable opposition to it. If you look at the opinion polls, both of students and of the country as a whole taken during the Korean War, you'll find that opposition to the war, the feeling that it had been a mistake to get into Korea, arose much more quickly and spread much more widely than it did against Vietnam. People forget now that though Senator McCarthy did remarkably well in this contest in New Hampshire against President Johnson, he got about 40%, 42% of the vote, if I recall correctly, running against an incumbent wartime president. Senator Kefauver got 52% of the vote, running against President Truman in the same state in New Hampshire in 1952, in the second year of the Korean War. And President Eisenhower, running as an opponent of the Democrats, successfully made the war and has promised to get out of the war his major issue in the election of 1952. One can say, I think accurately, that if violence is, and I think you can say as Rap Brown did, as American as cherry pie, one can say pacifism and anti-war activity is as American as apple pie. That to resist a war that you regard as immoral, to obey your conscience rather than your country, has been the standard American tradition. It's not a new one, it's not a unique one. To form a movement against a war in wartime is again not a new phenomenon, but a recurrent phenomenon. Every war we've been in, some segment of Americans have felt was unjustified, and feeling it was unjustified, have felt the need to oppose it, to refuse to cooperate with it, to resist it. Violence as an attribute of social movements of protest, again, is not a new phenomenon. Even campus violence is not new. If you look at the history of campus protests going back to the early 19th century, you find a considerable amount of violence, which makes some of the activities of recent years look mild. And I'm not exaggerating when I say this in terms of the use of bombs, blowing up of buildings, occupations, shootings, and other dramatic forms of activity which were engaged in by students in various parts of America during the 19th century. The abolitionists were rather violent in their protest activities against slavery. The Ku Klux Klan on the other side and some of the nativist anti-Catholic movements of the 19th century blew up churches, beat up people, and showed their propensity to violence. During the efforts to organize the trade unions in the United States, one found violence on both sides, by the labor movement and by its opponents. One of the dramatic episodes of American labor history revolves around an effort to blow up the Los Angeles Times in 1910 by people who were, I think, employed by the Printers Union, which never succeeded in organizing the Los Angeles Times. During the 1930s, the sit-ins, which spread to Europe and particularly to France in a dramatic fashion, began in the United States. Workers seeking to organize factories sat in, first in the rubber factories of Akron in 1934, and then in the automobile factories in Detroit and elsewhere in 1936. They seized property. The National Guard was called out against them, but the illegal seizure of property, which was made much of, did not faze these workers who used this as their tactic for organizing. And conversely, employers used hired gunmen both before World War I and later to prevent the organization of trade unions. So again, this pressure, the fact we have not had peaceful protest, just that protest has taken not just aggressive form, not just social movement form, not just anti-war form, but has taken violent form recurrently in the United States. Another element to the American political tradition, which is not quite in the social movement tradition, but which is relevant to the point I want to make, is the rhetoric of politics. Again, foreign observers coming to the United States in election time particularly are often thunderstruck when they hear the language being used by American politicians about each other. That it's the kind of language which one uses about traitors, about satanic opponents, about thoroughly evil people. Vice President Agnew, whose rather extreme rhetoric strongly offends the people he describes in the terms he does, reacts back by saying, but look, your people talk about my people in exactly the same way, only this you don't realize and it doesn't bother you. And I must confess, though I feel much more angry about Vice President Agnew's rhetoric than about any other, that I think he's right, that he is not untypical of the American context. President Roosevelt called his Republican enemies copperheads, which was another way to call them traitors, and even suggested that they were accomplices of Nazis and fascists. And they, in turn, of course, accused him of being an ally and accomplice of communists. So that this aspect is, again, an attribute of the American system. Now, if one raises the question of what produces these characteristics, these social movements of protest, of passion, this ability to resist the government, and, you know, for example, if you take the anti-war movement, there's no other country in the world that has anything like the tradition of anti-war activity the United States has. There's no other country in the world that has anything like the numbers who have refused to go, and who have resisted who've declared their position as conscientious objectors or opponents of the war, as the United States does. That a number of these things, I think, can be said to be not uniquely American, because some other countries have some of them and have them in less strong fashion, but to be more extremely American than they are characteristics of other countries, at least in the advanced, well-to-do, affluent, democratic countries of Northern Europe, America, and Australasia. Well, I would suggest here that if one wants to understand why this this position of protest, why the recurrent social movements from the extreme right, from the left, sometimes from the center, sometimes in relation to single issue movements that particular groups seize on as necessary, that the most important factor, though clearly like any complex phenomenon, not the only factor, nothing could be explained by one factor, still flows from another unique aspect of the United States, its Protestant tradition. The United States is, though few Americans are aware of it, the only, in one sense of the term, and what I think is the most meaningful sense of the term, the only Protestant country in the world. Now that statement may seem wrong, just obviously empirically wrong or exaggerated, because clearly there are other countries which are Christian and not Catholic, the Lutheran countries of Northern Europe, Germany, Scandinavia, Britain, which is predominantly Anglican, and the like. But when I refer to the United States as the only Catholic country, the only Protestant country in the world, what I am referring to is that it's the only country, the overwhelming majority of its citizens, particularly in the 19th century, though it's still true down to 1970, are adherents of the Protestant sects, mainly the Methodists and Baptists, but also, of course, other groups like the Quakers, the Christian Church, the Unitarians who deny Protestantism, and the many other Protestant sects. Now, one has to differentiate between the Protestant sects of these types and the Protestant churches and, of course, the Catholic churches, because the other major Protestant groups, as well as the Catholic Church, as the Lutherans, the Anglicans, to some extent certain Calvinist groups, have been state churches. The Lutheran Church is the state church. See? Religion exists. What do I do about that? Just go past it? Well, if I can go over that, the United States, as I started to say, has the majority of its citizens coming from the Protestant sects. Now, the state churches, like the Lutheran Church or the Anglican Church or the Catholic Church or the Greek Orthodox Church of Russia or Greece, and so on, the Byzantine Church, these as churches of the entire society were allied officially. They were established churches, therefore allied to the state, to the government, to the throne. There was the alliance of throne and altar. They acted as intermediaries and protectors of the government. And to be a Christian in their tradition, a Lutheran or an Anglican, one was expected as a member of that church to obey the law, to support the state, to give unto Caesar that which was Caesar, which in their case meant practically everything. The state churches also acted as mediators between man and the state and man and God. That is, if the church was the conscience of the society, not the individual. The individual, if he belonged to the church, if he went to church regularly, fulfilled his obligations to the church. If the priest gave him absolute absolvance, he was in good shape vis-a-vis his God. The church, in other words, was not, his religion didn't call upon him to obey morally in resistance to what was immoral in the world, unless the church itself called on him to do so, and then it usually only called on him to do so against foreign enemies of the state, not against enemies within the state unless they were seditious enemies. The Protestant sect, and also characteristic of the churches, is that one is born in a church. One is a Catholic from birth on. One is a Lutheran from birth on. One is an Anglican from birth on. One doesn't have to do anything to become a member of one of these churches. The Protestant sects, on the other hand, only take in members when they're supposedly conscious of fulfilling their obligations, when you have to study to become a Methodist. The requirements with the decline of religion have become less and less. It used to be very considerable, but one still has this phenomenon of one joins the sects or the denominations. And characteristic of most of them is that they place on the individual an obligation to adhere to his conscience. He's responsible to God for doing right. He is expected to be morally right. The church is not an instrument to tell him what is morally right and to absolve him from the obligation of doing the right thing. And this is particularly true for the Arminian forms of Protestantism, which have been the dominant forms of American Protestant religion. Well, in this context, in effect, we tell Americans And we've told them all through history, through the dominant religious tradition of American society, which has also informed American Catholicism and American Judaism, which, like all minority tendencies, take on the attributes of the dominant culture. We tell Americans that they must do what is morally right against the state. So that an American is not taught my country, in terms of this religious tradition, my country right or wrong. He is taught my conscience above my country. That where my country is wrong, I must obey my conscience in my relationship to my God. This has been the dominant aspect of the Protestant tradition. One stands up against other men, one stands up against the polity, one stands up against the state by adhering to the religious tradition. And if one looks at the great tradition of American protest from the Revolution down to the 1970s, you'll find again and again tremendous figures standing up and saying, I will not go along with the crowd, I will do what is right, I will tear up the Constitution, I will destroy, but I will not be forced to do evil. And on the other hand, if there are other men doing evil in the society, I must organize with my co-thinkers to destroy them, to eliminate them. I must also try to impose righteousness on the polity. I must try to make the polity a polity of righteous men. If there's anything sinful going on in it, like people drinking or doing other kinds of ills, we must catch them and stop them and prevent them from doing it. This is all part of this complex. It has informed our foreign policy. George Kennan, in his book on American foreign policy, and he's of course not the only person who has analyzed American foreign policy in these terms, has pointed to one of the great difficulties of the United States in foreign relations, that we don't deal with foreign countries the way most countries do. That is, as one country defending its national interests against other countries who you assume are defending their national interests. And what you do with countries, you make deals with them, to each one to try to maximize its own, or perhaps occasionally go to war about them. What we do, we regard foreign policy as right versus wrong. We go to war to make the world safe for democracy, to defend God, to crusade. And when another country adopts an evil social system, we don't talk to them. That is, we don't recognize the Soviet Union for 20 years since it's evil. We don't recognize communist China for 20 years because it's evil. A lot of countries which are as capitalist as the United States, as conservative as the United States, shake hands 2 days after the revolution. General de Gaulle, who was a good Catholic conservative, could make deals and talk to the Russians or the Chinese, because as a good Catholic conservative, it wasn't that he said communism is good or he had any better opinion of communism than an American evangelical Protestant. It was simply that as a Catholic conservative, he took it for granted that you don't expect to find righteousness in this world, that the world is full of evil people and that you have to live with them, and you even have to make deals with them. And Russians are Russians, whatever they may happen to be, and it's always trouble dealing with Russians, but you got to deal with Russians. I mean, that kind of image of the world is not an American image. We don't talk to the unrighteous people unless we're forced to do so over a long period of time. And this characteristic is of, say, dealing with the Russians or dealing with the Chinese. You find it again, it affected the Civil War. The reason we needed a civil war over slavery, I would suggest, is again this religious tradition. Because not only for Northerners was slavery a problem of morality, it was a problem of morality for Southerners. The Southern Protestants couldn't simply accept slavery as an interest that they were defending. They had to define slavery as a moral good. The image of the Southern divines was that blacks were slaves because they were the descendants of Ham, one of Noah's children, who was cursed that he and his children should be the slaves of slaves, or the servants of servants. And therefore, to change the position of the black, they defined in their theological terms, was immoral, not just an interest change. Now, obviously, this concept was a defense of their self-interest. That is, they ideologized or theologized self-interest, but once they did it, they believed it. Once they did it, they saw the world as defending righteousness against evil, and hence two righteousnesses can't be compromised. They have to, you get civil war, you get international war between people who feel they're absolutely right. you get a deal between people who are defending their interests, who are just out to make money and maximize economic interests or other interests. That can be, you can always strike a balance between the two. You can't strike a balance between God and Satan, between two forms of righteousness, until you've exhausted all efforts to crush and eliminate the other side. Well, this has been the American religious tradition. This has informed what Abraham Lincoln called the American political religion, in a phrase which he used long before the Civil War. And in this context, the passion, the enthusiasm, the moralism, which has gone into a variety of protest movements, from the right-wing protest movements, which have generally taken on a Protestant moralistic character, all during the 19th and early 20th century, directed against the Church of Satan, the Catholic Church, and against immigrants, but continues to inform it in relation to blacks and other groups seen outside of the system. And this moralism has affected left-wing movements and more popular movements in terms of their seeing struggles, and it's affected, as I suggested, our foreign policy as well as our domestic tensions, and it's made our rhetoric, the rhetoric of good versus evil, God versus Satan, truth versus the actions of traitors. Now, in this context, why hasn't the country blown apart? Because given the passion, and it did blow apart, of course, once in the case of the Civil War, and there were, of course, many other cases of threats before the Civil War of secession. Well, I would suggest, and I don't have much time to develop this theme, a variety of people have written to it, that the thing which has saved America from blowing apart, given this pressure on it for constant tension, constant mass social movements designed to implement the ideals of the absolute good society of utopia, has been the party system, that permanent, enduring party system I referred to earlier. Because the American party system has certain unique characteristics set upon it by the constitutional requirement that we have a president rather than a cabinet, and that we elect one man to the supreme power in the country. Because the coalition system, which exists in most of Europe and most countries which have parliamentary systems of government, where you get varieties of interests represented in parliament who come together in a coalition in a cabinet, that is impossible in a system where one man holds power. He can't be a multi-party president, even though maybe different groups can support him. And in effect, since the whole emphasis of the American electoral system is on electing one man, what we have are these two parties which are essentially multi-party or multi-faction coalitions. What we have in the United States, and I'll simply have to say this, I can't amplify it in the time remaining to me, is a multi-party system or a multi-faction system united in two coalitions. The Democratic and Republican parties are not parties in the European sense. They're coalitions of parties, coalitions of interests, coalitions of value groups of different segments who come together to help elect the president who seems most palatable to each of them, or governor, or whatever other post is up for grabs at the moment. And in this context, when a given group feels incensed morally about the way the society is going, when he feels that unrighteousness is on top of us, that he must do something to change it, to get rid of the evil thing, he may break out when a crisis occurs of war, depression, the consciousness of evil and slavery and so on. Certain groups will break out of this party system and start social movements or new parties, the efforts of third or fourth parties. Well, then what happens in this context? The parties are designed to elect people. In this context of being designed to elect people, they make genuflections in the direction of those groups that secede, that are causing the most trouble. And we're seeing this today, for example, a perfect example of something that's happened all during American history. Vice President Agnew very consciously has the task assigned to him, which has occurred recurrently in American history, of bringing back to one of those coalitions a group that went off the reservation. His task is to bring back the Wallaceites. And you bring them back by making noises that'll keep them happy, by suggesting that various things that they feel are deep concern can occur best through the Republican Party, by using slogans and terms that they have had. And this effort to incorporate the Wallaceites back in the system is, of course, a typical thing. The Republican Party, for much of American history, has had the task of bringing back right-wing splits into the system. The Know-Nothings came back with the Whigs into the Republican Party, and the Republican Party, for at least 30 or 40 years after the Civil War, was an anti-Catholic party. Republican candidates repeatedly made often vicious anti-Catholic speeches, which were designed to keep the Know-Nothings in the system. The Republicans absorbed the APA in the 90s and the like. The Democratic Party, for much of American history, though it's not that simple in relationship, but I won't go into the deviations from the pattern, has had the task of bringing the left wing into the system. The Democratic Party brought the populists back into the system. It reabsorbed most of the people who went off into the Progressive Party in the 1920s. It absorbed most of the socialists and the Huey Long followers in the 1930s. And various Democratic candidates, one of whom I gather visited here recently, have the job of reabsorbing the New Left and the anti-war protest movement back into the Democratic Party. As the function, viewing it in non-value, non-invidious terms, say of people like Senator McGovern and Vice President Agnew, are similar. Both are preventing our groups from getting off the reservation and permanently being alienated from the political system. And it's the flexibility of the American party system to appeal to these movements and to often, when they have to, because if there's enough pressure they do it, to make genuine adjustments, to actually do so many of the things they want, that enables the system to be stable. That is, that it isn't an inflexible system, but rather an extremely flexible system, a system that constantly adjusts to pressure from the outside, whether from the left or the right. There are two words, and I'll end on this, two words which are often used and which have a very different value connotation these days. One is co-optation. When you speak of co-opting a group, you're using it in a negative sense or in an analytic sense. You speak of taking a group into the thing in order to absorb them for your purposes. So you co-opt the opposition. You co-opt the anti-war people, the blacks, the Wallace people into your camp. But another word is responsiveness. If you're responsive, you do what somebody wants. Well, very often what somebody calls co-optation is what another person calls responsiveness. It's the same sort of thing. You're responsive or you're co-opting, but in any case, you're pulling the teeth of the protest by doing things which the protesters want you to do. Sometimes you do it very casually, very moderately. You do it in language and not in act. Sometimes you do it in act. But in any case, you do something to change the existing system, and it's this pattern which has prevented the social movement from tearing the country apart, from precipitating civil war, revolution, permanent instability. So that I think if one sees the American party system not simply as two organizations called the Democratic and Republican Party, which have simply endured and endured and endured because nothing's happened to create change, but rather as two organizations which have been much more flexible than parties in Europe, which are more ideological, more tightly organized, less heterogeneous. And if one sees also this repeated propensity of America to throw up moralistic social movements, moralistic movements of protest, one can begin to understand why a country which has had movements as powerful, as extremist, as alienated, as frustrated, as devoted to notions of absolute good versus absolute evil, has on one hand had so many of these movements, and at the same time has been able to survive as a stable political system. Thank you.
Okay, we can take questions from the floor now for a few minutes. Any questions?
Yep.
Could you stand up, please?
Some authors have suggested that this is a pre-revolutionary society, yet your thesis seems to suggest that there's a recurring cyclicity of these social movements. So I see a contradiction.
No. Well, I don't, well, I'd say two things. One is nobody ever knows. The question was, I'll repeat, that some people, some authors have suggested that the present situation is a pre-revolutionary one. and that my analysis or discussion suggests that what one has is cyclical periods of protest, sort of implying that this current period is just another a cyclical period which will change back in a more stable direction the way the previous waves have been, and will I reconcile or discuss these different points, approaches. Well, I'd say first, nobody knows whether a period is a pre-revolutionary situation until after the revolution. That is, there have been all sorts of periods in history when people have believed, revolutionists have believed they're living in a pre-revolutionary situation, or they wouldn't be acting, at least in terms of acting as if in a millenarian sense, in the belief that things are going to change tomorrow. And obviously all sorts of periods in which people have acted on that assumption have turned out not to be revolutionary. On the other hand, there have been revolutionary situations. There have been periods in which revolutions occurred, and as I say, therefore, no one can say with any degree of absolute certainty about any, he can act as if on what he believes is most probable, but he can't say it. There are just too many factors one doesn't know about, which both are unknowable or even if they exist, and which don't exist, new events which you can't predict and the like. But on the other hand, I would say, looking at the present situation, that there's actually less tension in American society today than there have been in earlier periods. That there's less division. There's plenty of division. There's obviously infinitely more division than there was in the 1950s or the early 1960s. But there isn't the degree of tension that existed in the early 1930s, that existed in the early 1920s, as I read American history, and certainly certain earlier periods in the 19th century. Now, of course, the present one may continue and become more tense and more cleaved, or the current quietude of 1970, which puzzles a lot of people, may be the beginning of a new cycle. I can't talk. I'm no prophet in this respect. If I had to make a probability statement, which I'm willing to make, I would say the probabilities are that this is certainly not anything like a pre-revolutionary situation, and in fact, I think the probabilities are that the period of tension that we've been in is probably going to relax quite considerably in the next few years. Yes?
We have a microphone here. We'd like you to use that if possible. So could you get it to him?
Sir, got a mic over there.
Oh.
You got a mic over there.
I have two questions. The first one is real simple, I guess. Do you think the direct election of the president would decrease significantly the flexibility of the American party system? And second, what American cultural traditions do you think will become operational as American society becomes, let's say, racially or socially segregated from itself?
Well, on the first question, I'll repeat it in a sense if you didn't all hear it. Will the direct election of president make a difference, really, in the pattern of which I've been suggesting? I don't know. It could, depending again on how it is set up. If it's a system which provides for a runoff, say, that you have to get at least 40%, which some people have talked about, and if you don't, there's a runoff election. That is, we have a runoff system, as some of the southern primaries do. That may encourage a multi-party system, because in that context, you can have, a number of groups like the Wallaceites run the candidates for president the first time round and then bargain afterwards, which would get more like the European system. So that a system of that kind could encourage the institutionalization, particularly if it also was then inaugurated on the state level, of multi-parties. If one's had a direct election system in which the candidate with the most votes got elected, I think that would continue the pressure on really two major coalitions. On the whole, a presidential system, even with a direct election, still would be more likely to see two major parties, but I think it would reduce some of the pressures, particularly if you had a runoff provision in it for a pure two electoral party system. On the other question as to whether these cultural traditions I've talked about with change, with breakdowns in race, with changes in the condition of race relations and class relations, I think those alone would not change it. Now, clearly, one of the things I talked about is sort of being at the at the sustenance of these patterns, namely our religious tradition, has become weaker. Obviously, Americans today, the proportion of Protestants are fewer. The commitment to church, to going to church, to belief, what it means to be a Methodist or Baptist, not to speak of any other denomination, is much less. So that this presumably should also, as time goes on, reduce some of this moralistic passion in the system. On the other hand, so far it hasn't. And seemingly, as in the case of, say, Weber's analysis of the relation of the Protestant ethic on work, you get a secularization of this religious ethic, and you have the so-called American creed, which Gunnar Myrdal talked about, which is a political creed, which we teach young people in absolute terms, is a kind of secularized religious tradition that we insist on a kind of adherence to two absolute moralistic creeds. But still, logically, I would say that there should be a decline in this commitment with the decline in the religious tradition. But so far, I would have to say one hasn't seen it. Certainly, one hasn't seen it in the late '60s.
We're going to call it now because it's 1 o'clock. Thank you all very much for coming.